Hello all. Today we will be going over part of the third unit of APUS history. I have to split this video into three parts because having all the details for this unit and putting it in one video will mean that this video is an hour long and my voice will be completely gone. So, for that reason, I'll be splitting Unit 3 into three videos, with this first video talking about the build up to the American Revolution and the conflict itself, the second video talking about the immediate political effects of the American Revolution, and the third video talking about Washington's presidency and the Adams presidency. So everything up to the Jeffersonian era, which starts in 1800. So let's get into it. Oh, why isn't okay? Let's begin with the early context to the American Revolution, which I believe starts with the French Indian War, where the sentiments of the war, or at least one very important sentiment, is very important towards a contextual understanding of the American Revolution. And the effects of this war kind of kick off that build up towards the American Revolution in the couple years before the revolution actually happens. So, to contextualize the French Indian War, we need to go big picture. We need to look at Britain and France and their war all across the Eastern Hemisphere, with this war being called the 7 Years' War. So Britain and France are kind of going all over the different the different territories they have all over the globe, attacking each other, trying to fight. And so that lands France right at the doorstep of the colonies, where they want to attack the colonies to attack a major economic resource for Britain. Because remember, the colonies were economic investment shown through many things like the Navigation Acts and the system of mercantilism. Go to Unit 2 if you want more details. And the Native Americans are involved in this war because of their own personal their personal disdain towards the colonists in Britain, because remember, the colonists invaded on Native American land that was rightfully theirs. And they kind of just took it over and displaced Native Americans from their own land. And some Native Americans are being used for slave labor. So it's obviously they're gonna have their gripes with the English colonists and with Britain themselves. And the whole call to action comes when France does arrive at the doorstep and makes their alliance with the Native Americans pretty apparent. And it's not like France is far. It's not like they don't have troops that they have to send over the seas to come to the colonies. They have Quebec. They have that Canada area right above the colonies. So this is a very imminent threat. And the British monarch is like, hey, colonies, you guys gotta get together and figure out how to help us in this war. And Britain, to be honest, had very little faith in the colonies, so they kind of demanded that they get their stuff together. Because remember, the colonies were just made for economics, not for longevity, not for defense, not for anything of the sort. The colonies, however, weren't really supportive of that idea, and they believed that they could do it. Here, I want to visualize the tensions between Britain and the colonies going into this war, and even after the war, up until the American Revolution. Because, um, currently, like I said in Unit 2, colonies in Britain aren't on perfect terms because of the lack of freedom that the colonies have through an example being with the Navigation Acts, which severely limits the colony's ability to trade with anyone else but Britain. And heavy taxes and tariffs are hurting the economic output of the colonies and the wallets of the colonists. And there is some favoritism at play for those colonies that are more loyal to the British monarchy. So take the middle colonies. So like New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Those colonies are more under the heel of Britain and just follow them without any gripes towards taxes or tariffs. While some other colonies like Virginia has their own gripes and voices them with the monarchy, and this kind of differentiates the colonies into two different groups, where one is more loyal to the the British cause, and one is kind of thirsting for freedom, and that leads to severe division and thus tensions between the colonies and Britain. And here in the Albany Plan of Union, we even have division between the colonies themselves. So the Albany Plan of Union in 1754 was called by Benjamin Franklin, and Ben Frank was like, "Hey, we need to get together, like now, so that we can fight this war. And in order to do that, we can't only be united under the British monarchy. We need to have our own government that will guide us, handle us politically, make sure we're stable, make sure we have resources, yada, yada, yada. But the whole issue with this is that the colonies were whole under the British on a more big picture scale. They were together, they weren't fighting, like actually like violently fighting, but on a deeper, more internal level, the colonies were fractured because like their trade was messy, their land was like, when I say their land was messy, I mean there weren't no clear boundary lines between lands sometimes, which led to conflict. Like they were on bad terms pretty much, and that made it very difficult to work together. But what Ben Frank hoped for is that the extreme circumstances of this war would push them together. And this document here, I pointed out not only because it's very important for the AP and for a general understanding of this, like the sentiment of the Albany Plan of Union, but also because it's just supposed to push the colonies together. Where, look, even the document visualizes it. Together, they make a whole snake, but currently, they're fractured. They're all split apart. If they unite, they're gonna have a chance to win. But if they don't, they're gonna die. Like that snake looks dead, because the colonies are gonna die. And although this plan was rejected, the colonies did kind of get forcefully united under the British during the war, which we'll get into later. But the whole point of the Albany Plan of Union is that it's kind of this early sign of like a democratic government. It's kind of showing how the idea of a democratic government didn't just come out of the blue. It was hinted towards in the French Indian War, because a central government body handling resources and is supposed to resemble the politics of the colonies kind of sounds very similar to the current U.S. politics and our own government, and to the government of the um Americans during, like, right after the American Revolution. Let's move forward. So the actual conflict of the French Indian War, I'll be discussing battles, but honestly, in a lot of these wars, the battles themselves aren't super important. It's primarily things. Honestly, everything else is important. Politics, economics, context, effects, stuff like that. That's all important towards understanding why wars happen in this course. But nonetheless, still important to cover it. So the captains, George Washington. Who doesn't know George Washington? He was the captain of the colonies, and William Pitt was the British captain for this war. And they were going into the Iroquois Confederacy, which I slightly talked about in the Unit 1 video, which was pretty much just a band of 5 Native American tribes that represented the Native Americans' military power. They were like the primary military force. And then an assortment of French captains that aren't really that important, to be honest. The battles themselves consisted of the Battle of Louisbourg and the Battle of Montreal, but the most important was the battle and the surrender of Quebec, which was a very significant hit towards the French, and that was like that made them lose their holds in that Northern American region, where we see at the end of the war, after the Peace of Paris, France loses its foothold in the Northern American region, but also, most importantly, the colonies get a whole bunch of land, and they are very, very happy about it. Land here is seen as the spoil of war, so they're in their head. This is like their fruit of labor. So it makes sense why they would be happy about it. But Britain, on the other hand, isn't really that happy about it because they had to get their hands dirty. William Pitt comes into the colonies, and seeing that the colonies aren't really built for war, what he decides to do is that he decides to end salutary neglect. So, salutary neglect states, well, doesn't really state anything, but pretty much the idea is that as long as you do whatever we ask you to do, we'll stay out of your hair. Like I said earlier, excuse me, the colonies had a lot of internal issues, like with trade and with land, that could have very easily been solved if the British monarchy got involved. But the colonies are doing what they had to do and made the British money, so they didn't really give it much mind. With the war, it was necessary for Britain to get involved or they would lose the colonies. And in order to further strengthen the colonies' military power, William Pitt employed this policy of impressment, where he took innocent colonial sailors and he forced them into the war. He put a uniform on them, gave them a gun, no prior war experience, and he made them fight and they died. That pissed off a lot of colonists, obviously. But what also pissed them off is that they had a lot of taxes and a lot of resources were taken from the colonists and they had no reimbursement. So they The British just took, and the colonists got nothing in return. And that leads to the tension meter rising once again. New taxes, impressment, no reimbursement, and a much firmer hold on the colonies wasn't going to please any of the colonists present. Now, after the French Indian War, we come across the eve of the revolution, as I like to call it, the next 10 or so years that highlight the end of salutary neglect, issues on taxation and on the representation of the colonies, and the colonial civilization and its soon to like the transformation it's about to go through soon. So let's begin with the Proclamation of 1763 and Pontiac's Rebellion. So, like I said earlier, a lot of land was gained. The colonists were very excited to go onto this land because again, it was seen as their reward. But this was Native American land, and the Native Americans, after just losing a war, having a lot more hatred for the colonists, and because they already had that hatred from them already taking over their lands, they weren't gonna give up their land so easily. So, Chief Pontiac of the Native Americans fights back. He spills colonial blood. Colonists spill native blood. A whole conflict breaks out. Britain brings the hammer down and they end the conflicts. So you might think, oh, Britain and the colonies, they're all good. The Britain's gonna be like, go ahead, take over the land. We'll support you. No. Britain reprimands the colonies, saying, you can't do that. No. And the Proclamation of 1763 was established. What it said is that there's a boundary line on the Appalachian Mountains that prohibits any colonists from encroaching upon that land. So pretty much just sets up a boundary. And this pissed off a lot of colonists again, because they have no reward. A lot of their resources were taken, a lot of them died, and they have no reward at all. So that was very aggravating. New taxes. Not all these are taxes. I should have labeled this the new acts section, but the most important thing here is taxes. Sugar Act, tax on sugar. Mutiny Act. Any British soldier can come into your house, make themselves at home, set up there, and they can take all your resources, no punishment. The Currency Act would regulate the production of paper money and kind of force the colonists to use the British currency, which, again, forcing the colonists to do something during this time wasn't really the best idea. The Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is the biggest one out of these acts because what it did is that it taxed pretty much any form of paper. So if you took a sheet of loose leaf to doodle or to write something, you're taxed. If you took a postcard to like put it on your mail, your tax. Like it wasn't necessarily the economic the cost of the tax that made a lot of colonists mad. It was simply how absurd it was. It was just like you're taxing like something that's so commonly used, and of course it's going to anger a lot of colonists. The Declaratory Act comes a bit later than all the rest of these acts, as these acts are primarily in that 1764 1765 issue date. But the Declaratory Act, what that does is that it kind of establishes this supreme control that Britain has over the colonies, and again, pissing off a lot of colonists because we do not want to be supremely controlled. Like speaking from the point of view of a colonist, like especially during this time when a whole lot of other stuff was happening and the tension meter was rising. 3 whole bars this time. Because colonists were reprimanded for trying to reward themselves, they faced unjustified and unruly taxes, and Britain attempts to even further their control against the colonists, which is so crazy. And that's going to make a lot of people mad. End of salutary neglect, and the response to all these conflicts comes with many groups. Here I list only some of them. The Paxton Boys and the Sons of Liberty often led these rowdy, not violent, but disruptive revolts and protests. And the regulator movement was just trying to challenge some of the acts that I just discussed last slide, like acts like the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, and the Sugar Act, and the Paxton Boys in specific were arguing even just for tax relief. Politics wise, things like the Virginia Resolves were important because, again, they show these early signs of a representative government, one and a democratic government, one that employs autonomy within the states and a fairness among any acts. The Stamp Act Congress was a very strong source of protest, with 9 of the 13 colonies banding together to petition and fight against the Stamp Act. And another very important thing here is challenging virtual representation. Why is the end quote missing from there? But virtual representation was pretty much this idea that oh crap, that the British were representing the colonies despite there not being any colonial delegates present in like the British court. And when all these acts were designed, there were no colonial delegates. Rather, there were British men there that were acting as representatives for the colonists. So this kind of starts this whole no taxation without representation idea that we've all heard so many times before. But now you see how, like, the true meaning behind it, the colonies weren't really being represented. They were being represented by the British, not by the colonies themselves. They were enforcing and pursuing the like only acts that would benefit the British, but not what would benefit the colonies. And so all the colonists decided to come forward and kind of push to get their own representation. This wouldn't come to fruition as we're kind of on the eve of the revolution already. And then we reach the tipping point, which is the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre, we've all heard the story. Colonists get shot during a protest, and that leads to an all out riot among the colonies. Like, there's a lot of newspaper publishings about what happens in Boston during this. And it doesn't matter if the shot was intentional or not, because there's a lot of speculation that the shot wasn't intentional by the redcoats that were stationed in Boston, but the shot happened and colonists died, blood was spilled, and if it wasn't going to be the massacre, it was going to be something else, because as as like you saw from the tension meter that I accidentally showed just now, like we're already at the peak of tensions, but what really like is in addition to this tipping point of the Boston Massacre is the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. The Tea Act, huge taxes on tea, a very common commodity among the colonists. So a couple of colonists get together and what they do is that they dump buttloads of tea into the ocean. And it's not like tea is cheap. Tea is very expensive, like hundreds of thousands of dollars were lost because of the Boston Tea Party. And remember, money is everything to Britain during this time. So losing a whole bunch of money because of tea, because of these these insubordinate colonists was very aggravating. And bam, tension meter is full. Colonists die at the hands of the British, and the Boston Tea Party is a big middle finger to the British. And this is where the revolution starts with oh crap. So now we move into the conflict and politics of the American Revolution. And just to start off, revolutionary sentiment is born with Thomas Paine and even earlier with Enlightenment ideals. But let's talk about Thomas Paine first because he's definitely the much more important thing here. Thomas Paine is the publisher of the pamphlet Common Sense. Common Sense was made to be something very accessible, even to those who couldn't read fancy words, or even those who could hardly read at all. It was supposed to be something accessible to all of the colonies so that every colonist could hear out Paine's ideas, which made complete sense and it swayed many towards the patriot cause. What Paine was saying is that how does it make sense for a nation, a whole ocean away from the colonies, to bark orders at us and force us to do this and do that? And how come they have their own autonomy and freedom and we don't? And we are just as human as they are. We are as just as much of a civilization as they are. And a common analogy for it is as if a satellite was commanding the sun. And I like that analogy a lot. In regards to Enlightenment ideals, I believe last unit we talked about John Locke and his social contract, but also Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract. If you wrote, if you remember, Rousseau's social contract discusses splitting off the government into three branches: legislative, executive, judicial. And this was very appealing to the colonists because we already had so many hints towards this balanced central government that will be able to maintain political stability and solve issues. We've seen this with the House of Burgesses, with the Virginia Resolves, with the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, with a whole bunch of things. And the whole stress was a rational government that could hold political stability. But the main thing of note here is Tom Paine's Common Sense, which was seen as like the basis for the Patriots, like the Patriot cause. Continental Congresses. First one, the first Continental Congress happens right, like literally, like maybe like a year before, if not like the same year the Revolution starts. So, Continental Congress rejects colonial rule, repeals oppressive legislature, so like all the acts, the Declaratory Act, the Stamp Act, stuff like that, ceases all trade with Britain. The Olive Branch Petition was kind of like this last warning, like, hey, if you don't listen to us and a you keep being mean to us, then we're gonna like fight back. We're gonna like revolt. And then the Second Continental Congress, the British rejected the Olive Branch Petition and said, hey, we own you. And the Prohibitory Acts were set in place, which banned the trade, except it was on the British's own accord, so pretty much all resources were cut off to the colonists. They had to make do with what they had. And the Declaration of the Right to Bear Arms was kind of like, okay, let's start the war. So, what the Declaration said is that America has the right to get guns and fight the British for their own independence. And as I said earlier, the Articles of Confederation, 1777, the year that the American, well, right around when the American Revolution began, we see like we see this central government that has been alluded to many times holding colonies together and stringing them together so that they can fight this war. Something that was alluded to in the Albany Plan of Union, but didn't really come to fruition. But came to fruition here. But in the next video, we're going to see why the Articles of Confederation weren't all that good. But that's a story for next video. But no, it's just what got the colonies by for now. It's what persisted until the creation of the Constitution, the actual conflict of the American Revolution. So here I just laid out the four main battles, in my opinion. Battles of Lexington and Concord. First battle, it just set up the groups here. The British Minutemen versus the Patriots. Bunker Hill. This kind of shows like the colonists, despite being the underdog in this situation, were still able to put up a good fight. Washington, of course, still leads the colonists, and this actually starts off a common trend where war heroes and big generals of wars are going to become presidents. We'll see that with Zachary Taylor. We'll see that with Washington. We'll see that with Eisenhower. We'll see that with a lot of people. But Bunker Hill, although it was a huge loss, we dealt a very, very heavy blow to the British and William Howe, who was seen as like the primary British commander. Howe was responsible for the naval force, which was Britain's like strongest asset in this war. Britain is known for their navy. They had a whole naval blockade surround the colonies, so they were pretty much trapped in. But yes, this was a very heavy deal, a very heavy blow to Britain. Battle of Saratoga was the turning point for the revolution in terms of battles. Huge win for the Patriots. Patriots. And France, remember, France and Britain are rarely ever good together. Like, they're rarely ever on good terms. And with this victory at Saratoga, the French were like, hey, maybe they do have a chance at winning. And they decided to lend their aid to the Patriot cause. Battle of Yorktown, just the final battle of the American Revolution. Bam, America wins. Continuity. This is going to be the first continuity slide of, well, the first dedicated continuity slide of this whole series of videos. So, here, circa 1780, the British come to the South, attempting to gather support from the Loyalists, because remember, colonies are divided into Loyalists and Patriots. Loyalists are those who, despite wanting some autonomy, are still, like, they still want to be underneath Britain, because remember, Britain is very strong, Britain is very powerful. That's a whole dilemma I'll get into in the third video of this unit, because it's a lot more prevalent there. But the Loyalists only refused to support Britain because of slavery. Remember, slaves are usually congregated in the South because of most plantations and crop settings being there, because it's just ideal for growing crops and agriculture. But all in all, Loyalists refused to support Britain because of slavery. They want to stick to, like, because Britain is promising to free slaves, but that's not going to stick well with the Loyalists, because slavery is pretty much their whole like basis for living. That's how they get their money. That's how they get their agriculture. That's how they get pretty much their entire like economic system. This same precedent is present like 60 plus years later in 1840, where the Southerners in America are clinging to slavery because of how pivotal it is to their life, which I'll get to in about 3 videos when I get to Unit 4. But what this pretty much sets up is this idea that the South will stick to their slaves. They will prioritize slavery over anything because of the benefits that it brings and how it's such an integral part of their lifestyle. Oh. End of the war. War ends 1783, Treaty of Paris. So America's independent, but they still owe a lot of money to Britain for damages for any debts before like the First Continental Congress and the rejection of the Olive Branch Petition. And the Mississippi River is the official boundary of America. Declaration of Independence. Who doesn't know the Declaration of Independence? we the people, representative of the public's beliefs for and desires for independence, unalienable rights, all men are equal. So there's actually two things wrong in those four words. So men and equal. Because America isn't only just men. Half of the people viewing this video, maybe even more, are probably women. All women, women aren't equal to men. And equality isn't omnipresent throughout America. Slavery persists for a long time for this. After the Declaration of Independence, nearly 100 more years. So we kind of see despite the Declaration of Independence being based on this ideal of freedom and equality, it's very peculiar why America still clings to its slaves. But this is the conversation for the Unit 4 video. End of the first video, because this is probably long enough. So we'll jump into um the the Constitution, issues in the Articles of Confederation, all the political stuff that is very important to this unit. And if you're gonna watch AP Gov and are just watching this because why not? I mean, if you're gonna take AP Gov and just watching this because why not? Or if you're one of the APUSH kids who just want to hear this for AP Gov, this is very important, and I'll be sure to go into a lot of detail and a lot of continuity about this. But yeah, that ends the first video. Bye, guys.